Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 31 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Cold Weather Ops. The big news of the week was the Concorde jet landing in New York at John F. Kennedy Airport on October 19, 1977. Unlike other regular commercial airplanes, the Concorde was a supersonic aircraft capable of flying at 1,330 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of sound. It could go from Paris, France to New York in a little under 3.5 hours, where normal jets took 8 hours. Despite the fact that none of them would be flying on this awesome plane, it was still exciting news. Our social studies teacher seized on the opportunity to make it a learning experience. While the Concorde had actually began scheduled flights in January of 1976, the United States Congress prohibited landings in the U.S. due to citizen protests over noisy sonic booms. The U.S. Secretary of Transportation, understanding the political viability for rapid transport of politicians and world leaders, gave permission for Concorde service to Washington Dulles International Airport, which began in May of 1976. The U.S. ban was lifted in February of 1977, although New York banned the Concorde locally. This ban ended on October 17, 1977, when the Supreme Court upheld a lower court ruling to reject the continuance of the ban by the New York and New Jersey Port Authority. It was noted that the subsonic noise of the President's aircraft, Air Force One, was louder than the Concorde. Kevin arrived home excited about the news of the Concorde jet. He loved to fly and had a great interest in airplanes just like his father, and looked forward to talking with him about it. His dad was not home yet when he got there, so he set about to get his chores done to pass the time. He was also looking forward to dinner, since his dad would be bringing fish and chips. After feeding and watering the birds, he went out to check the garden. Growth was slow since the temperatures had fallen considerably, but there had not been a killing frost, and the hardier plants like bell peppers and tomatoes were still producing. He picked a few vegetables and took them into the house before grabbing the first of 2 buckets of coal from the garage storage bin. Nighttime temperatures were dropping as low as 36 degrees and never higher than 47. Coupled with a cold north wind blowing off of Lake Michigan, the nights could get downright frosty. As such, it was his and his brother's responsibility to bring 4 buckets of coal in each day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the evening. These were kept in a box near the old stove. Standing in the corner of the central room, the one between the kitchen, living room, and bedrooms, was the large potbelly stove. For those who have never seen one, a potbelly stove is a large steel cylinder, which is used to burn wood or coal to provide heat and sometimes even for cooking on, as the top is flat and a pot or kettle will rest there nicely. It had relatively few parts, especially when compared to modern heating appliances, but the ones it had were key to its operation. It had a small door at the bottom for collecting and removing the ash of burnt-out fires, and a large door for loading wood or coal and lighting the fires. A pipe coming out of the top disappeared through the ceiling to vent the smoke outside, and within this pipe was a damper which could be controlled by turning a handle outside the pipe. The damper was intended to keep cold air and insects out when the stove was not in use, but more importantly, it was used to regulate the fire. By closing the damper slightly, one could slow the escaping smoke and heat through the pipe, which in turn slowed the amount of oxygen provided to the fire from the vents in the ash door. This would make the fire less intense. In effect, the damper was the thermostat. Opening the damper fully would allow the fire to rage, while closing it almost all the way would cause a fire to smolder. Closing the damper all the way while a fire was burning was discouraged, as it removed the escape route for the smoke. Eventually, the smoke, which could not escape any other way, would find its way out of the stove to choke anyone in the house. Emptying the second bucket of coal into the box, Kevin noticed the stove was cold. He had not realized this until now because his chores had kept him warm. Now, standing in the hall, he noticed the chill in the house. He opened the door to find the fire was completely out. He opened the lower door and shoveled the ash into the bucket before putting wood and paper in to start the fire for the night. Carefully layering wood and paper as he was taught, Kevin made a base fire and put several lumps of coal on top. The heat of the wood fire would ignite the coal, and soon it would be warm again. When it was ready, he closed the upper door and struck a match. As he moved the wooden match toward the lower door to ignite the paper, a breeze blew out of the stove and put out the match. Undaunted, he reached up and closed the damper until the breeze stopped and lit another match. This time the fire made it to the paper, and he watched until it caught well. Feeling confident the fire would not go out, he grabbed the bucket of ash and headed outside to dump it in the pit in the field dug for that purpose. It was starting to get dark by the time he was returning to the house with the empty bucket, and Kevin wondered where his father was. He should be home any time now. He climbed the porch stairs and headed back to the stove to put the bucket in its place. The air seemed heavy, and he began to cough as he noticed the smell of burning from the stove was intense. Coming up the hall to the stove, he saw smoke pushing out from the cracks around the doors and realized he had forgotten to open the damper after lighting the fire. He opened it fully to allow the smoke to escape and listened as the fire began to roar. Within moments, he could feel heat coming off the stove and stood close to warm up. Once he was sure the smoke was fully cleared, he closed the damper a little to slow the fire and keep it from using up the fuel too fast. He liked the old potbelly stove because it was like having a campfire in the house. He went to his room and grabbed one of his outdoor magazines before settling into a high-backed wooden chair near the roaring stove. Lost in a story of a faraway hunt, Kevin felt like he was really there, as the crackling of the fire made it seem as though he sat at a campfire. The warmth of the fire was soothing. After a long day's hunt, the men gathered around the fire for warmth from their favorite flask and a meal. Someone put a large cast-iron skillet on the fire, and each man took a turn adding something. One put in sliced onions, another cubed potatoes, and the third sliced carrots, while the fourth added chunks of meat. A generous dash of salt and pepper was added with some flour to make fine gravy, and as an afterthought, one of them poured a can of beer in for flavor. Kevin could almost smell the delightful concoction and knew they would eat well. Then he realized he was getting hungry too. Looking at the clock, he saw it was nearly 7. He cast a glance to the back door, but there was no sign of Dad yet. When he was bringing in the coal for the stove, he had seen his mother warming baby food for his little sister, so he knew she had been fed. He cast a glance into the bedroom, and in the glow of the television, he could see his mother was asleep with the baby on the bed next to her. He wondered what she had eaten today. Returning his attention to the story, he tried to ignore his hunger. The men around the campfire were eating now, and one of them hollered at another to turn off the flashlight and stop looking at his meal. He said there was no sense in making himself sick by looking at the food. If a stray fly or mosquito had gotten in there, it would surely add to the flavor. Kevin laughed at this, as the stillness around him was shattered. "I'm hungry," Mark complained. "When are we going to have dinner?" "Dad is bringing fish and chips," Kevin said confidently. "We'll eat as soon as he gets here." "When's that going to be?" Mark asked. "I do not know," Kevin said patiently. Kevin looked in to see if his mother heard, but she was still asleep. He was hungry too, and it was already a couple hours since Dad should have been home. He decided he could at least get them a snack to hold them until dinner, and got up from the chair. Leaving the magazine on the chair, he headed into the kitchen with Mark following. There was not much in the refrigerator when he looked. It was Friday, and Mom would not go shopping until tomorrow. There was a lump of hamburger on the shelf next to a few cans of beer, and in the cabinet he found a can of mixed vegetables. Thinking back to the story, he got an idea. He put a small pot on the stove and put the hamburger into it, followed by the canned vegetables and a can of beer. Mark watched from the table as Kevin turned on the fire and soon had the contents of the pot boiling. The kitchen began to fill with the smell of vegetable beef soup, and Kevin added a bit of salt and pepper to the mix. He tasted the broth and decided it was good. Watching the pot, he gently stirred until he saw the hamburger was fully cooked and turned off the stove. "This is good," Mark said as he dug into the soup. Kevin dipped his butter bread in and tasted the broth. Mark was right. It was good. Although, he wished it had some rice in it like when Grandma made it for them. He was not sure how to cook rice and knew Grandma always used her pressure cooker when she made him beef soup. He also did not know how to use a pressure cooker. Kevin looked in the pot as he put his bowl in the sink and saw there was still another bowl of soup left. He looked in on his mother when he returned to sit by the fire and saw she was sitting up now, smoking a cigarette. "Hey, Mom, I made some soup," Kevin said. "You want me to bring you some?" She did not even speak, just shook her head and looked back at the television. Kevin sat back in the chair by the fire to stay warm and read. He looked over the magazine at his mother occasionally and wondered why she always seemed so down. They had a decent place to live that was theirs, and even if they were poor, they still had chickens in the garden to give them food. He dozed off, wondering about this. A loud banging noise woke him, and Kevin looked up to see his father putting something on the kitchen table as the screen door slammed behind him. He got up from his chair and put the magazine back in his room. He glanced at Mark asleep on his bed as he headed back to the kitchen and wondered if he should wake him up. He decided against it since his belly was still full from the soup and figured Mark's would be too. Looking at the clock as he passed the desk, Kevin saw it was already 10 o'clock. Continuing to the kitchen, he expected to see cardboard boxes full of fish and chips, but instead there were 2 large salmon laying on the table. They were impressive and had tags from where they had been weighed at the bait shop. One was 15 and the other almost 25 pounds. Obviously, his father had been out fishing without him and took his fish to be weighed for the contest he entered every year. "Did you get the fish and chips?" Kevin asked. "No, I'm going to fry some fresh salmon," he said. Kevin looked at the fish and decided he would be okay until morning with his belly of soup. Sure, fresh fried salmon was good, but it was not like having deep-fried fish and chips. He also did not want to get wrangled into cleaning fish this late at night. His mom came into the room behind him, and he knew when he heard her exasperated huff that she was not happy. He took advantage of the moment to disappear back to his room and curled up on the couch. He fell asleep listening to his parents arguing about the missed dinner and his having to cook soup. Waking to the smell of fresh coffee and cigarettes, Kevin knew his father was already awake and probably in the kitchen. Rolling out of his couch, he stretched and stumbled to the bathroom. It was Saturday, and he had the whole day to do whatever he wanted. He noticed the space heater standing under the sink was on, and knew that either his mother or father planned to take a bath soon as they were warming the room. The pot of soup on the stove sat empty, and Kevin wondered who had finished it. He hoped it was his mother, as he was not aware that she had eaten anything the previous evening before he went to sleep. But, seeing no pan dirty and the lack of smell from frying fish, he figured it was probably his father who finished off the soup. He was right. "Where did you learn to make vegetable beef soup?" his dad asked from the dining room. "Read about it in one of my magazines," Kevin said as he got down a bowl for cereal. "The guys in there use steak, but I figured hamburgers chop steak, so it should work just as good." "You did good," his dad said. "It was good. I also liked how you put in a can of beer. It gave it good flavor and brought out the beef flavor." Kevin carried his bowl of cereal to the dining table and sat down where he could look out the window at the chicken coop. The birds were all huddled together on the roosts off of the ground. "The birds look cold," Kevin said. "Yeah, we need to fence off part of the garage and open a hole so they can get in there when it's too cold." his dad continued. "After you eat, go ahead and feed the birds and then meet me in the garage." "Okay," Kevin said between bites of cereal. The sun broke through the trees and Kevin turned his face to it. The warmth felt good. Looking down, he saw the chickens agreed with him as they were all around him by the fence where the sun was shining. He made sure they had fresh water and moved over to check on the ducks. The ducks quacked loudly to greet him as he entered their cage and gathered around. They wagged their tails and nuzzled him with their beaks appreciatively as he put food down for them. It dawned on him that his ducks acted more like dogs than birds, and he wondered if that was normal. Not that it mattered. They were his ducks, and he liked them. He reached down to stroke their feathers and gave them a little scratch under the base of their wings like they liked. Going into the garage, his father had already framed up a short wall to divide the duck and chicken areas. He knew they would just cut a hole in the wall from the chicken coop, but wondered how the ducks would get in here. He held the wall frame in place as his dad nailed it up, and then helped to stretch chicken wire across it and nail it with a staple gun. They stood another short wall to close off the chicken area from the rest of the garage, and then a long wall to close these two areas from the rest of the garage. Before enclosing this with chicken wire, his dad set two of the pre-hung doors that were stored in the garage into the long wall. Standing back when they were finished, his dad snapped his fingers and walked over to his workbench. He came back with two floodlights that he used when he painted cars and hung them from the rafters. One for each area to give the chickens and ducks a source of heat for when it got really cold. Turning on the lights, Kevin could feel the heat from them immediately, but a cold draft came across the garage to chill him from the back wall. "Hey, Dad," he began, "that back wall lets in a lot of cold. How are we supposed to heat the birds with that wind?" His dad looked at the wall and held a hand out. Looking around, he spotted a few sheets of old plywood standing in the corner and moved them around the pen. Standing on edge, it only took 4 sheets to completely enclose the fenced-off area. Now, when Kevin went in, he could feel the temperature rising. Using the jigsaw, his dad cut a square hole into the chicken coop from the garage side. After a few minutes, all of the chickens found their way in, and they watched as the turkey pushed his way in. Kevin grabbed some hay and piled it on one side to give the birds somewhere to nest, and then turned his attention to the duck area. As he spread hay along the fence near the chicken side divider, Kevin watched his father cut a circular hole in the garage to the outside. It was about 18 inches in diameter. Going outside, he helped to grab the remaining section of large plastic pipe that was stored beside the garage and stuffed the end in the hole. At the other end, his father used a pair of wire cutters to open a hole in the duck pen, and they pushed the pipe in there. Kevin had wondered what the pipe was for when the supplies came for their bathroom. This piece was the same size as the hole, much too large for a sewer pipe for the septic system. Had his father always intended to use it for this, or was he just making use of a past mistake? Either way, the ducks took to it right away and headed into the garage en masse. Kevin moved the water tanks and feeders into the garage pens while his dad went inside to use the bathroom. He liked the idea of this, as it would make his job easier when feeding the birds, since their food was stored in the garage. He watched as the birds made themselves at home. Even the turkey seemed happier now. When his dad returned from the house, Kevin was in the duck cage surrounded by them. They seemed really happy to have a way inside out of the cold, and he watched as they went in and out of the tube, as if to show it to him. "Okay, the last thing we need to do is move some of that plywood in the attic over the pens to keep them from flying out," his dad said, looking up into the attic. Kevin looked up there as his dad began to climb the ladder into the attic. He was surprised his dad was even aware of the ladder, and wondered what he would say when he found his bug collection there. Did he even know that Kevin went up there? His dad stepped onto the first rafter and started to move toward the center of the garage, away from the vent opening. "Hey, what are all these canning jars doing up here?" he asked, and stepped onto the plywood. "What's that yellow stuff in them jars?" Kevin watched his dad walking slowly on the plywood. He knew he would be close enough to see what was in the jars any moment, but he also knew That is where the plywood hung over the edge of the rafter. "Hey, watch your step up there," Kevin said. "There's a piece of plywood that does not reach across to the next rafter." "Where?" his dad asked, turning. The plywood started to tip up as he stepped on it, but when he turned and put both feet on the unsupported wood, it responded immediately by flipping up and slipping down between the rafters. Kevin could only watch as his dad slipped between the rafters to land on his feet on the ground in a puff of dust. He was quickly followed by over 24 canning jars which had been catapulted by the plywood. As jars rained from the attic, his dad put his arms over his head to protect himself, and Kevin watched as they hit the ground all around him, shattering to pieces. Luckily, the cold weather had subdued the wasps, hornets, and bees as they only crawled lazily around in the dirt. But the look on his dad's face, the way his nose seemed to suck in and his eyes began to water, told Kevin the answer to his long-forgotten question. What happens when you pee in a jar and leave it in a hot place for a long time? It turns to ammonia. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.